There's never been a bigger disconnect between DC Comics and their customers than there is right here, right now, today. I think during the New 52, DC Comics understood their customers' wants and needs far better than they do now. They are constantly running out comic books that people don't want, hiring creators that can't sell comics that people don't want to read. And I have the perfect example. This is the best example of the enormous disconnect between DC Comics and their customers. Right here is this short story that's coming up in Detective Comics written by Sina Grace. And it's also a wonderful example of why I wonder if you guys feel the same way. I have a feeling that I'm not the only one here that feels like they're being taken advantage of by DC Comics in a lot of their publishing initiatives right now. So here's the details. Starting in Detective Comics 1059 in April, we're going to get a 3-part story from Sina Grace. It's going to be illustrated by David Lampton. David Lampton's a good artist. It's going to be called Gotham Girl Interrupted. Who's asked for a Gotham Girl comic book? This is the one thing during Tom King's entire comic book run on Batman that he created was Gotham Girl. Launched with some fanfare, immediately forgotten. The character is not very interesting, completely overpowered. But you think about the title there, the title Gotham Girl Interrupted. Of course, that's lifted from a novel called Girl Interrupted. You might remember it was a Winona Ryder, Angelina Jolie movie. When you put up the Venn diagram between Detective Comics Batman fans and Girl Interrupted fans, what do you think? How many people do you think are stuck in the middle? 14? Is that what we're going for now? We're trying to satisfy 14 consumers with this stupid tacked on story? Not to mention that Sina Grace absolutely sucks. Everyone talks about Sina Grace's Iceman, and Iceman was an abomination. I've heard it is not completely Sina Grace's fault, but they certainly bear some responsibility because they did write the damn thing. But you go look at what Sina Grace has done at DC Comics, and it's been pretty laughable. Specifically, I say go read the Green Lantern 80th Anniversary Special. He's got the very last story on there. It is fucking unreadable. It is atrocious. Yet DC Comics continues hiring these people that none of their customers want. There's actually a difference between DC customers and Marvel customers. Obviously, there's a much bigger crossover than Girl Interrupted in DC with Marvel and DC than Girl Interrupted in DC. But there is a difference between the two comic book universes. There's a much better chance that Sina Grace would get over with Marvel Comics fans than they ever would with DC Comics fans. They absolutely failed there, so now they get their opportunity at DC Comics. And they decide that the best course of action to rehabilitate their career after giving the opportunity of a lifetime is to do Gotham Girl Interrupted. I feel like, maybe you guys feel like, I can't be the only one. When DC decided they were going to put these extra short stories on the end of their regular series for another $1, it's supposed to be value add, right? We all know it was so they could charge an extra $1 for the comic book. It's not like they put anybody good on those for the most part. You and I are being charged $1 so Sina Grace can rehabilitate their career by putting in there that they wrote in Detective Comics at DC. One of the top 5 probably best-selling ongoing titles at DC Comics. Why am I being charged? Why are you being charged? Why are we being taxed so Sina Grace can put on their portfolio that they wrote a Detective Comics story? This is bullshit. DC Comics and Ben Abernathy, the Batman group editor, know that nobody reading Detective Comics wants this fucking story. But they're going to make us pay for it anyway if we want to continue reading Detective Comics. Whether you read it or not, you're paying for it. And Sina Grace gets to say, well, my comic book sold 75,000 issues. And we all know that's bullshit. If they released the Gotham Girl Interrupted one-shot special, how many copies do you think would get ordered? How many copies do you think DC could fucking sell of this comic book? I think they could sell reasonably. I think comic shops would order 5,000 copies max. There's literally no interest in the character, no interest in the writer, and no interest in this story whatsoever. There's probably something you can do with Gotham Girl. Gotham Girl Interrupted just isn't one of them. It's embarrassing what DC Comics has become. It's embarrassing that DC Comics don't respect their own customers, don't even recognize their own customers for who they are. that they put this drivel out there, and you know, without a shadow of doubt, it's going to suck. Sina Grace got the opportunity of a lifetime to write the Iceman series. Controversial at the time. People were going to at least read the very first issue. X-Men character, original X-Men character, huge in the X-Men cartoon series. Everybody knows who Iceman is. The A-list? No. But he's a much bigger, more important character than someone like Sina Grace had ever earned in their career to write. And they dropped the ball so spectacularly on their way out Marvel. They actually burned all their bridges because they knew at that point it didn't matter how many diversity boxes that they checked. They had failed so spectacularly that CB Cebulski and nobody was ever going to let them have an opportunity again. This type of failure on that type of level should be a career killer. It really should. And the way that Sina Grace treated Marvel, and I don't mind people giving Marvel crap, probably should have burnt their bridge over to DC as well. But DC is so hell-bent on driving all of their customers away for this new phantom mysterious audience that does not exist, that they're willing to come in here and subject their readers to Sina Grace, charge them $1, and dare them, and fucking dare us to say, we don't think you got what it takes to walk away. We don't think that you have the testicular fortitude to not buy your Detective Comics. We already put fucking Mariko Tamaki on the book. Now we'll put Sina Grace on it. There's nothing you can do about it because you guys are so addicted to Batman. You're so addicted to your DC or Detective Comics. You're so addicted to your complete comic book run that you will never stop buying. That's basically the dare that they're giving us. Why drive away readers? Why drive away customers? Makes no sense, but it is DC Comics' new business strategy. They're even trying to drive people away from Batman. Now, I will admit, Mariko Tamaki's Detective Comics is not nearly as terrible as I anticipated it would be, but it ain't great neither. There's been a few really nice highs, a lot of stuff right there in the middle that is meandering and average at best, and there have been some absolute fucking stinkers, especially recently if you've been reading the Shadows of the Bat event series. This is what Sina Grace themselves had to say, and you're going to be excited to read this comic story after you hear Sina Grace sell it. Many of the conversations I see about mental health in pop culture are focused on getting better, which feels like an incredibly unfair angle for those whose struggles don't go away with a pill or talk therapy. Gotham Girl is a story that redefines and brings heroism to the concept of getting by. Looking at her entire backstory, there's no easy fix to the pain Gotham Girl has been through, and this story examines that in a meaningful way that I hope steers her future moving forward. Well, I certainly hope it doesn't. Actually, I hope it does, because I think Gotham Girl is an absolute abomination of a character, and I do think this will be the coup de grace. This will be the final nail in the coffin for Gotham Girl. So I say, absolutely, don't do 3 issues, make it 6. Let's do everything that we can to put the final nail in the coffin of Gotham Girl. I'm all for that. But nobody that comes into DC and Marvel Comics, not nobody, okay. 1%, potentially 1% of all of DC and Marvel readers read something like that as far as the pitch. Oh, this is going to be exploring what it's like to just get by and how that's heroic. And go, fuck yeah, I'd like to buy that comic book. 99% of comic book readers look at that, they laugh, they roll their eyes, and they go, what the fuck is going on here? What is wrong with DC Comics? Why the fuck do they keep hiring these people? Unfortunately for Sina Grace and Paul Kaminsky, Sina does kind of give the receipts on who did this, because there's another quote. I've always wanted to tell a story about how complicated a teenager's life would be in Gotham City. We haven't had enough Robin fucking books over the years. My editor, Paul Kaminsky, blessed me with the best angle ever by asking me to think about Gotham Girl's next chapter. Claire Clover and I found each other at the best possible moment, as I've spent a lot of time exploring how we, as people, carry on with trauma and grief in the long run. It's been a wildly satisfying experience juggling these heavy themes with a character who's in high school and has Superman's powers, plus Gotham City. Tom King drove this concept into the ground. People are tired of dealing with trauma. They want to see heroism. This isn't a very pleasant time in our history. People are looking for hope. They're looking for alternatives. And people like Sina Grace, Paul Kaminsky, Tom King, they just want to make your fucking lives miserable as miserable as they can, and they fucking want you to pay for it. It gets very, very frustrating when you read stuff like this. Sure, this is just a short story in the back of Detective Comics, but they're charging you for it. And Sina Grace is going to say they had a best-selling comic book for something that nobody ever asked for and would ever actually pay for on their own accord. This wouldn't sell enough to be a hit at fucking Image. It wouldn't sell enough to be a hit at Boom. Yet DC Comics, one of the two major players in the American comic book scene, is shoving it down your throats. And you wonder why manga is beating the holy hell out of comic books right now. The disconnect between DC and their fans is wider than ever. The audacity of DC Comics to continuously ram this shit down our throats and tell everyone that the comic book industry is fine. It's not fine. Look in the mirror. You are not successful right now. Your comic universe is in shambles. Wholesale changes need to be made. You're about to be merged over with Discovery, and there's a good chance that a lot of your fucking jobs are on the line. It's time to step up, realize the mistakes that you've made, and see if you can fucking save your own asses. Because right now, I can only think of a handful of people at DC Comics that aren't completely fucking expendable. Almost everybody at DC Comics not only can be replaced, but probably there's a good chance they damn well should be replaced with their performance over this past year. Future State sucked, and it only got worse as we got through 2021. And with shit like this, it's only going to get worse as we get into 2022. There's no hope left. DC Comics is DOA. As long as they keep bringing in the Sina Graces, the Cecil Castellucci's, the John Ridleys, the Mark Wades, the Brian Michael Bendises, the Tim Sheridans, and a host of other absolutely dreadful fucking creators. DC Comics are daring you and I. They're saying you can't give up Detective Comics. We're so certain that you can't give it up that we're going to shove a Sina Grace Gotham Girl Interrupted story down your throats, and you're still going to pay the dollar for it. And they're probably right. Last week was one of the worst batch of new comics DC has released in some time. I did a video on two of them, Superman Son of Kal-El and Green Lantern number 10. It was absolute cringe fest at DC last week, and it's only going to get worse in 2022. You got to check this out.